Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mack.
Hello, myth and magic fans. How inventive can your monsters be? I want to urge you to be like Bosch in your monster creation and think surreal when creating your beasts. I wrote a fairly detailed chapter on creating your own monsters in my non-fiction manual that's titled So You Want to Write Fantasy. And I don't really want to go over old ground. As I say, I went into that in quite a lot of detail. But I have recently been asked how crazy you can be when you create your own monsters. What quirks and extravagances can you allow yourself when you're creating your most grotesque creatures? And I guess the simple answer to that is that you should allow your sleeping brain, your dream mind, to do the creative thinking for you when it comes to writing your monsters. Surrealism, with its emphasis on spontaneous and automatic and subconscious creation, has always been the best place to find the most terrifying yet believable monsters. The power of creative imagination is limited by the prosaics of science and convention and acceptability and perhaps even permissibility in certain cases or certain societies. But brain activity is not limited by these social conventions or by any self-imposed impediments whilst you're sleeping. So the manifestations that you experience in your dream state are probably driven by your deepest desires, your obsessions, or they're said to be driven by your greatest anxieties. So your dream monsters, the monsters in your dream visions, become wild and untamed. They become motivated by obsession. They become spurred by desire. They become ambitious. And they become, of course, unbound and unlimited. The 16th century Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch, B-O-S-C-H, created about 25 works of art, which we know of. But the best known of his is a triptych altarpiece called The Garden of Earthly Delights. Now, there are three parts to this creation. There are two side wings which fold inwards to cover the main body of the painting. The two side wings represent the Garden of Eden and the Last Judgment. And in the centre, the main picture, there's depicted an image of unholy existence that begins, when you first look at it, as if it's a familiar scene. It looks like it's perhaps a theme park or a holiday camp and people are enjoying themselves. But when you examine the ideas in the artwork more closely, you see that it actually does contain a bunch of surreal monsters. So, for example, in the picture, and I'll put the picture on my site for you to look at neilmac, neilmach.me. But in the picture there are giant unicorn cats. There are men who make love to owls. There are children with plums instead of heads. There are camels with human bums instead of humps. And it's certainly true that this piece of art is driven by the artist's subconscious cue. In other words, it's driven by the artist's dream mind. This was the first surreal art that became world famous, but there of course have been many since. On the right hand panel, what people call the hell panel, it contains images such as a giant bird eating humans, which are then excreted like eggs, and these eggs fall into a vat of vomit that has been seasoned by pieces of silver that have been released from another man's butt. It contains a squashed albino flying fox that holds another guy against a table and stabs him in the shins with what looks to be wooden spoons. It depicts a pig wearing a nun's habit, while there are dogs in armour and thumbtack helmets who bite into a man's windpipe. Now, I don't know what Hieronymus Bosch had been doing before he painted this picture, and I certainly don't know what he'd been doing before he had such bad dreams, but I guess it would have kept the famous dream interpreter Sigmund Freud in work for quite a few years had Hieronymus Bosch stepped into his surgery. But I think you should be like Bosch. That's the mantra. Be like Bosch. I think you should be like Bosch and try to use the same techniques when you create your surreal monsters. So here's some tips. The first one is decoupe or decoupage. This is also known as chaos magic. So this technique is where you allow your unconscious brain to decide for you from a set of inputs and create the monster out of almost thin air. And that's why it's chaos magic. So it's often a matter of writing a few words that have just occurred to you on a separate sheets of paper and then shuffling and arranging those words and trying to find maybe two or just three, sticking them together and making a new concept. So you write down some words which just come to you out of thin air and then you put the words together. The trade-off, of course, is that your final creation has been limited by your previous and original choices because you had to obviously think of the words in the first place. Would your dream brain have done the same thing? Yes, maybe it would, because perhaps a brain that's asleep can only use images that it has cut out of your daytime waking experience, which incidentally is why it's decoupage, because decoupe means to cut out. And so the dream that your brain comes up with actually does come from your conscious brain. In other words, you cannot come up with something completely new, but only a variant of something that you're already familiar with. And the advantage of this is that if you're thinking up a thing from a set of inputs that's been given to you by society, then others, in other words your readers, will identify and appreciate the horror in those ideas. And that's why I think the Garden of Earthly Delights is so horrifically monstrous. It's because we recognise the demons that are portrayed within it. The second technique, and it's allied to the first technique, but it's slightly different, it's called the razor blade chaos technique. Razor blade chaos. This is more or less exactly the same as decoupe, except to some extent you don't control the inputs because they don't come from your own brain, but instead they come from the brains of others. So how you do this technique is you find and you cut out some nouns from printed matter, hence the razor blade. These normally are found in newspapers or magazines. For some reason, I don't know why, but when I've tried this, I've always found cooking magazines to be really good, with recipes in them. Anyway, find some nouns in those, you mix them up, and then you come up with some new two-word creations. Now, apparently, poet T.S. Eliot used this technique for some of his ideas in his 1922 poem, The Wasteland. And pop artists such as David Bowie and Tom York have used the razor blade chaos technique to create quite surreal ideas for their own song lyrics. So the idea is if you look up monster nouns, then employ the razor blade technique, you might come up with some truly innovative ideas. The next thing I want you to think about is what's called the startle response. Regardless of what comes to mind, whether you use the razor blade technique or any other technique, make sure that your monster startles your reader. That is, make sure your concept is so totally unexpected that it makes them jump. You've heard the expression, jump out of your skin. You will know how much I dislike worn and hackneyed and overused themes in fantasy. You know, the whole spooky sheets, headless horseman, flashy vampire, naive goblin, callous troll, exotic dragon tropes that go on and on. I call all of these monsters Scooby-Doo constructs. Not only because you can find them in any kids' cartoon mystery, but because the writer clearly does not have a clue about how to create a monster. If you use shop-used monsters, shop-worn monsters, like these, ask yourself this: where is the surprise? Where is the horror? Where is the alarm? A monster in your dreams will be so horrible that sometimes it will literally knock you out of bed. It's so scary, it literally gives you a jolt. A really bad monster will flabbergast you and it will awaken you. It will awaken the sense of fear inside you. It literally jolts you into consciousness. Surprise represents the difference between expectations and reality. And the next thing I want you to think about is unexpected awakening. The appearance of your monster must be totally unforeseen and unprecedented. I don't just mean that your monster shouldn't resemble anything else in creation, but its manifestation should be unforeseen. To bear witness to this, remember that millions and millions of people will have seen The Garden of Earthly Delights by Bosch, and yet the albino flying fox, to take just one example, is totally remarkable, and the concept just stuns the viewer. It's adventitious, and adventitious means it seems to be there by chance or by whim rather than by plan, and that's the genius of Bosch. That's what makes it surreal. It's not an integral part of our expectations. How the heck has an albino flying fox come into this weird and grotesque world? That's what makes it so scary. That's what makes it so creepy. That's what makes it so surreal. And Lovecraft, he was a good writer in this regard. He understood that we have to make manifestations which are totally unforeseen. So the environment influences the nature of any interaction with your monster. In other words, the thing isn't just weird. A flying fox is weird, but a giant flying fox is even weirder. A giant albino flying fox is weird. But it's also that the monster is in the wrong place at the wrong time. To capture this thought and represent these ideas in your work, try to focus on describing touch and body movement and how the time moves when the monster is nearby, and the pitch, volume and intonation of any sounds that your creature makes. Remember that these sounds don't just come from the creature's voice box. They also come from the bones and the guts and the butt and the muscles and the hair and the skin and the claws and the teeth of the monster. And also remember that the monster will violate acceptable social behaviours, or it will not act in the way that most readers would anticipate. A good example of this, of course, is the Joker in the Batman franchise. He's a monster. Yes, a human-looking monster, but a monster which works against your expectations. And that brings us to juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is all about overlapping and playing with duality and with counterpoint. So when you use juxtaposition, you move two different or contrasting items closer to each other or even next to each other to make a comparison. The obvious example of juxtaposition in monster making is Beauty and the Beast. Less obvious but still explicit is Jekyll and Hyde. And that must have been a spectacular idea when it was first published back in the day. Likewise, when Bosch described two garden birds, two songbirds, pretty songbirds, eating humans, there's a juxtaposition there. The best of all these juxtapositions places two elements side by side and allows the reader to form their own opinion. And that's what you do when you read Beauty and the Beast. You start off with one opinion and then your opinion changes. Don't forget that both sides can be represented within the same body. So with Jekyll and Hyde, they are one and the same. And a monster can be wise and greedy. A monster can be crafty and forgetful. A monster can be bloodthirsty and gracious. There should always be an easily comprehensible contrast between the two elements. So make sure you use juxtaposition in your monster creation. And once you've created your monster, don't forget to double check it against the surreal checklist. So ask yourself, once you've decided on the form and the behaviour of the monster, ask yourself, is it wild and untamed? Is it motivated by obsession? Is it spurred by desire? Is it ambitious? Is it unbound and unlimited? If it's not one or more of those, and preferably the more the better, then you'll have to go back to the drawing board and try again, because it's not surreal. So good luck with your monster creation. Tell me how you get on, please, and please share tips and ideas or your experiences on Twitter at Neilmach, Neilmach, all one word. But that's how insanely inventive you can be with your monsters. What is the curse of exoticism, and how can you make your fantasy cogent and relevant? Fiction, even fantasy fiction, must have an air of reality and of authority. So a good fantasy writer will always challenge exoticism at every point. But what is exoticism, and why does it encourage and bestow implausibility? Well, here are 5 ways to avoid exoticism in your work and make your fantasy compelling and persuasively relevant. First of all, I want to say that it's okay to be weird. It's okay to have quirky elements in your work. Of course it is. In fact, that's the beauty of fantasy fiction. But the truth is, if you can handle the truth, too much weirdness and too much improbability will turn corny. I always say that cheese is the smelly byproduct of exoticism. The word exoticism, if you haven't come across it before, derives from the root exo, E-X-O, which means outside, and it literally means seeing something from outside. So that's why we think of a foreign land as an exotic place. But remember, it's not exotic for its inhabitants, because they don't see it from the outside, they see it from inside. It's only exotic by our standards. And it's because we're looking at another world from the outside instead of understanding it better from within that makes it a problem. So a better definition of the word exoticism, and it's the one I prefer, is the allure and the fascination of something that's unknown. And this is the way that artists, not necessarily just writers and poets, but also painters and potters and other creatives have throughout the centuries represented a sense of otherness that makes the techniques sometimes seem vulgar and even embarrassing, and in the worst case scenarios, cringeworthy, because they've gone too far into exoticism. To understand this a little bit better, I want you to think of the famous cantina scene in the first Star Wars film, A New Hope. Do you remember it? The amazing scene where an extraordinary array of completely weird and different life forms are hanging around, and there's a meeting and there's a bit of a sword fight going on. But it's an amazing scene. It's something which really burned into people's imagination when they saw that. And yet it's exotic. It certainly is seen from the outside, and it's of foreignness. Now compare that scene, the cantina scene, with any of the Jar Jar Binks scenes, but especially compare it with the fart scene. Jar Jar's material isn't outlandish or otherworldly, is it? It's artificial. It feels unintelligent. It feels tasteless. It feels rude. It feels clumsy. And so there you are. That's where exotic has gone too far and it's turned into cheese. Surely, as a fiction writer, you will want to stay well away from binksing any of your work. So yes, you can, and indeed you should, be an escapist, as they were. They were very imaginative when they were designing the famous Star Wars cantina scene. But you should also watch out for any of these trends that tend to break into what I would call the curse of exoticism. So how will you do this? Well, I would like you to avoid the following. Number 1, general decadence. This is attributing a sense of moral decay to your characters just because they're not from this world. For example, suggesting that they have a lower standard of decency, or they have poorer morale, or they have a general lack of dignity, or poor self-discipline, or a lack of basic skills. So why would an elf, or a troll, or a witch, or a blacksmith, or even an ogre be more indecent and more immoral and more unworthy and more undisciplined and less skilled than you and I? You see this kind of general decadence all the time. You even see it in things like Game of Thrones, books which are held on quite a high pedestal. I would dare to suggest that those types of characters, your blacksmith, your witch, your ogre, your elf, would probably be even more ideological, even more self-respecting, even more accomplished than we will ever be. So try not to decay your characters. Number 2, low competence. Ask yourself this: is the set of skills demonstrable in your work which allows your character to be efficient and to work properly? So what I'm trying to get at is, if a guy has been chosen to be a henchman, then he's been chosen to be a henchman because he has some significant and valuable skills. Otherwise, he would never have been chosen for the role. A necromancer is a good sorcerer, and he or she is scholarly. A warlock performs brilliant spells. A bravo swordsman becomes proficient with the sword through hours and hours and hours of practice. A minotaur has all the strength of a bull, but the impulses of a man. Do you see? Although all these are fantastic creations and they come from another world, they possess credible competencies. And you ought to not only describe those competencies in your work, but also celebrate them. And going hand in hand with that, the next thing I want you to think about is identifiable skill gaps. Because while your characters have demonstrable skill sets, they will also only be plausible and convincing if they are also depicted with quite obvious skill gaps. So, for example, Luke Skywalker cannot use a lightsaber until he's shown how to do it. He might be able to pilot a skimming vehicle across sandy terrain because he did it on Tatooine, but he couldn't pilot a spaceship, a starship, without instruction. And Harry Potter, he needs to learn about curses and hexes before he can ever defend himself against the dark arts. These are skill gaps that were identified and then discussed and described in those works. So identify the skill gaps and discuss them. That's how you'll make your characters more convincing and more plausible, and how you'll escape exoticism. The next one is ethnocentrism. 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 It's a tendency, unconscious or not, to see other societies and other civilizations as subordinate or inferior to us, to the writer and therefore to the reader. And so, for example, the ancient Greeks thought that all other civilizations that they ever encountered were barbarians. And when explorers set out on voyages of discovery from the cities of Europe, the people they met on their expeditions, the indigenous people, they always described them as primitive. But primitive compared to what? Primitive compared to who? Primitive against what criteria? Well, it's the criteria that's imposed by us. The very notion seems to suggest that there is some kind of presumptive civilization scale, and that we use this to compare other societies and other civilizations. The worst extremes of this type of exoticism is thinking that everybody else outside our known world is a savage. But as fantasy fiction writers, we must also be aware of thinking that some characters, for example, extraterrestrials or elves, are higher up on this imaginary civilization scale. So in those cases, it's us, the writer and the reader, who are the savages. Do you understand? The way to tackle this trend is to identify true competencies, to describe the skill gaps, like I told you before, and to celebrate the complexity and the diversity of creation in all its richness and all its vitality. So you need to think of that cantina scene again. Think about the skills and the skill gaps and the competencies and the complexities in the Star Wars cantina scene. And the final thing you should avoid is cliché. How many times do I have to say that, by the way? The first man who compared a woman to a rose was a poet. The second man who compared a woman to a rose was an imbecile. So said the French poet Gérard de Nerval. But you can't draw on everyday experience, can you, when you're creating a sea monster, or when you're describing a dragon flying through the air, or how you're explaining whether a vampire comes to life after it's dead. So how does an author of fantasy fiction bring fantasy conceptions to life in a way that is understandable to their audience? Well, the shortcut method is, of course, to use archetypes. The public, which is your readership, will know what an elf is and what an elf is capable of because they've seen it many times before in movies and they've read The Lord of the Rings over a dozen times. Likewise, they can get their head around a zombie and they can easily picture a witch boiling her concoction in a big black pot, her cat on the side and her broom pushed away in the corner. But these are merely cliched suggestions, aren't they? You wouldn't write hot as hell or red with anger or stubborn as a mule, I hope. So why would you describe an elf as impossibly beautiful? And by the way, just going aside for a moment, elves were originally described as gloss, Gloss. In other words, they were described as satanic in English verse. So how did we lose that connection, the connection with evilness, so easily along the way? Was it because of Tolkien? But anyway, going back to what I was just saying, cliched suggestions. Why would you describe a godmother as wicked or a ring as enchanted? Please avoid stock characters and avoid stereotypical props. Avoid them like the plague. And as I've said many times before, using yet another cliched suggestion, think outside the box. So good luck with your fantasy creations, but try to avoid the curse of exoticism.